All right, hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan, Josh,
Hello, everyone.
Marcelo,
Hello, everyone.
and we have a special guest and a fourth person for the first time in the new year. Please welcome Ken Drew. How's it going, Ken?
Living the dream.
So our introduction for Ken. Ken Drew is a military veteran and a current student at USF. He's in Florida. Much warmer than it is right now for me. It was about -19 today. And he's also the host of Taboo Topic. Yeah, actually, I was on his show twice, and I'm finally repaying the favor. So Ken is another political commentary show. You should check him out. Before we get into our announcements, today we're going to cover the Democratic bills aimed at reforming voter laws. Spoiler alert, they did die on the Senate floor, but they were the Freedom to Vote and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We're going to outline what those were and then discuss some of the major ideas underpinning them. And you can, before that, you should go follow us on Instagram, which is at Between the Liars _ between each of the words. We have a Facebook page. Our Twitter is at Between Liars. Please follow that one. Make some accounts. Follow because we're at like we have one new person, so it's like up to 19 now. We also have our YouTube channel and a TikTok. So I'm going to turn this over to our special guest now to tell us a little bit about his podcast, like the major theme, and maybe highlight what the upcoming episode is and what one of your more recent ones was.
So basically Taboo Topic, it's kind of the name it by itself, where I cover taboo topics and subjects, or really opinions that people may have but are too afraid to speak out loud. For obvious reasons, we live in a cancel culture, at least from my perspective anyway, where if you say anything that remotely goes against the ruling class, to say the least, and their points of view, then you're deemed unworthy to have an opinion, or even you're even worthy to even look into the story as well. So it's kind of in the logo itself where it says underneath the taboo topic, honesty equals understanding. And in order for us to achieve real peace within our own society, and we don't have to necessarily get along, but in order for us to achieve real peace in society, we have to at least be able to be honest with each other. And that with that honesty comes a genuine, true understanding. At least we're not going to agree with each other, never, but at least we have a genuine understanding. We can get along with each other. We don't have to like each other, but we can get along. So that's really the premise. The last episode I posted was last Wednesday. Actually, we talked about homeschooling and the rise of homeschool and how many parents, as a matter of fact, we're at 11% now of parents who have completely taken their kids out of public schools and they're 100% homeschooling their children. And we look into the rise and why that's been the case. I even have a friend of mine who was homeschooled himself and talked about the advantages and disadvantages of homeschool and why it's important to do your own research. And this upcoming week, I'm going to actually do a week in review. So I try to post 2 episodes a week, one on Wednesday where I do a hot seat edition, I call it now, where I pick one particular topic or idea or opinion, and I kind of just scrutinize and do my own research and kind of figure out why this opinion is popular or unpopular for that matter. And then a week in review editions, I may have a guest with me, like Ryan has come on my show once to do a week in review edition where we just kind of go over like stories we found interesting for the week. So if it's just me, normally I just do like 4 or 5 stories, but if I have a guest, we can go up to 8 stories and we give a general synopsis and then give our initial reaction afterwards. And on that show, I like to really encourage my audience and or actually my guests, Ryan can attest to this, just go ahead and be blunt with your thoughts, because I'd rather know where you actually stand instead of just trying to be polite. So by all means, check it out. You can follow me on Instagram as well. I have my own Instagram. I just type in Kenjin_Express. Spell the word engine, put the letter K in front of the word engine, then you get Kenjin, one word, 296.substack.com. Or excuse me, I'm just talking about my Substack newsletter, which I also have that in correlation to my podcast. Because for my Wednesday edition, I do a monologue, but you can actually read the monologue yourself on my Substack website just by typing Kenjin296.substack.com. So that's pretty much it for me. So I'll let you guys do the rest of the talking. I'll follow your lead.
All right. Yeah, Ken is actually the reason we got an Instagram. So Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about where people can find us live or pre-recorded, just depends on the week?
Depends on the week, depends on the session, but we normally try to get episodes out once a week around noon Central. As always, when we are live, we do love for you to come by and catch us. We love seeing you there, interacting, and answering any questions or comments you may have. It can be enriching both for the show because a lot of the thoughts and concerns we may have or kind of takes we may come to aren't really going to always match up with the public because a lot of us, are isolated in very intensely politically focused areas. And so having that interaction with the public and, helping us ground ourselves outside of our ivory towers of academia, is always really great. So whenever we can do that, we post our videos up on our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook channel. So you can find, when we go live and all of our past episodes there. You can binge watch them all if you can tolerate the sound of my voice for that long. You can also, we still have our merch up on Redbubble, and so they can put on all types of different things that are just nifty. It's the only way to describe it. A Redbubble just does a ton of different things. And you basically give them an image and they'll slap it and put it on whatever you want them to.
As always, and as every show, we have our new music, which is fantastic. It's courtesy of Andrew Hensley. Thank you so much, Andrew. At Secret Spike Studio 865 Audio. And his new single is Misty, and it's available now on all major streaming platforms. Please check it out. The music is just chef's kiss.
And Ken is back. Ken, you might have missed it. I'll repeat what Marcelo said. Go listen to Andrew's new single. Hopefully, connections hold strong. So today, we're going to start with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Here is what the main idea behind that was. Number one, it wants to reverse the 2013 Supreme Court ruling on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Specifically, it wants selective pre-clearance from the federal government, the Department of Justice, which would be required for states to update their voting laws. So this would include things like if they want to relocate their polling places, if they want to impose stricter voter ID laws, it would have to be cleared by the federal government. And Marcelo, why don't you talk to us a little bit about what is in the Freedom to Vote Act?
Right before I get into that, I'm just to make sure, we're talking about bills that just died, right? So we're sort of like doing like a little autopsy on these bills that actually never made it through.
Yes.
So just by the way, just for context, I'm just repeating what you said. And this is important because we're obviously not talking about bills that might pass. These are bills that will not pass, but might come up again in the future, hopefully, at least in my opinion. I know it's
at least the ideas should. I mean,
right. Some of this will come back, just not necessarily in this specific form. So the other one of the bills that we're talking about is the Freedom to Vote Act, which has many different things. So we highlighted a few for y'all. The first one is that it makes Election Day a national holiday. It allows states to have early voting at least 2 weeks prior to Election Day, including nights and weekends. It allows voting by mail with no excuses needed. It requires that states make voting more accessible for people with disabilities. It requires that states that require IDs for voting would have to broaden the types of identification acceptable, so more than just maybe driver's license or whatever they have right now as acceptable IDs. It requires same-day voting registration and online registration, and also makes it easier to register at places like departments of motor vehicles. So at DMVs, it would be easier to be registered as a voter in case, like me, you don't drive. I guess not in my case because I don't vote, but you get the point. And finally, it strengthens the Federal Election Commission's ability to investigate charges of campaign abuses and require that states replace outdated voting machines with ones that, among other things, provide voters with paper records of their ballots. So it's a lot of things. I feel like if you would have to call it like an omnibus, like voting bill, this could be it because it has a lot of things that do a lot of different things. So I think tackling each one at a time or separately would probably be best. I'm in favor of most of these things, if not all of these things. But again, I'm sure that another opinion is not widely shared. There's a reason why it failed. So
for our discussion, let's start with an easy one. Let's talk about making Election Day a national holiday. I know I am going to be in favor of that, and I'm assuming Marcelo and Josh would also be. Kick it to Ken. But I actually I took the inspiration from Peru. for a proposal I had to do for a persuasion class, talking about the importance of making it a federal holiday, letting people have the time off. I'm curious, kick it to the group. What do you guys think about, the one item of making it a national holiday?
I will put an important caveat here is that even though you are making this a national holiday, there are some people out there that don't have holidays simply because of the way, society works. People who work in either like very demanding industries, who work in like EMS, or who work in restaurants, who work in malls, like these places like where there's a holiday, in 4th of July, you are out with your family, but somebody had to sell you the hot dogs, right? So there's people out there working anyways still. So I'm in favor. Not to say I'm not in favor. I am in favor, but just it's a caveat that it might be a holiday, but not necessarily for everyone.
Otherwise, it'd be a great day for criminals. All the police are at the voting polls. So there has to be kind of a staggered thing. But no, that's a good caveat.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with a little bit with Marcelo here. I like the idea, but it concerns me that I'm not sure it would do enough to realistically be worth having. And so people would see, okay, we now have this. And so it would dissuade public pressure and public opinion from pushing for more changes. Because while this will help, not only are there people who like emergency services and other kind of critical infrastructure that always needs to be working, there's a lot of jobs where you don't get off for the holiday, even they are just fairly mundane jobs aren't going to close. Like Walmart does not shut down on 4th of July. So it would help a lot of people, but it would mostly help government employees more so than it would most private sector employees. Because while a lot of private sector companies do close for federal holidays, that is an individual company decision. So it would help some people. But as we might say, in investigating the worthwhileness of a piece of legislation, I'm not sure its significance by itself would realistically produce a meaningful change for a lot of Americans who struggle to make it to the polls in the first place in the status quo.
Ken, can you hear us now? I know you've been having some tech difficulties. That might be a no. Well, I guess we'll come back to him. So, all right, my take on that then is going to be that, I think that it does in a way make it more accessible, just flat out, because if, just by the pure numbers, if it's a federal holiday, then, say, for example, universities, they're going to have, students who will be off. So, students could skip class theoretically if they wanted to, but I feel like if your target audience is also college students, that helps. If your target audience is going to be people who are in positions where they wouldn't necessarily have to be on call, but they could take off for the federal holidays, then, I think it just happens to broaden it and make it more accessible. I also think that it does wind up sending the message that, voting is important if it's, if you're legally allowed to do so. Sorry, Marcelo.
It's okay. Again, we might get into that later, but
yes,
it's just like if it helps people, it's also like maybe a little too symbolic for my taste.
Yeah,
it's good, but it's just, I think we can agree that it's just okay. Like it's positive.
So to me, I'll kick this off. Now we'll start diverging and we'll be at maybe a little bit more at odds. The federalization is the problem to me here because the states were designed to run their own elections. Over the course of history, we have seen where that becomes problematic. It did require federal intervention. But by and large, unless there is a good reason for the election standards to be federalized, I believe that should be left up to the purview of the states. So my question then would be like, why should the federal government, especially like when it's the Department of Justice, be able to restrict state election laws, oversee that, and standardize it? Like, what is the reasoning for that, and what would be the benefits of that?
So when the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 and struck down a section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4B, what that Section 4B did was target geographic regions in the United States with specific legislation that only certain states and certain counties were subject to the purview of this law. The Supreme Court ruled that this, in a sense, violated the Equal Protections Clause of the citizens and of those states in comparison to the other states. And so, it wasn't fair. Like, yes, those states were picked because, when the Voting Rights Act was first written in 1965, they were looking at a lot of former Confederate states, and they were looking at a lot of places of where intense voter infringements were happening. Now, it's worth noting that not all former Confederate states were covered by this. Take Tennessee, for example, was not included in the pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act of 65. So I guess, in the way that the John Lewis bill works differently to restore and amend the Voting Rights Act to bring it in compliance with what the Supreme Court said in the Shelby v. Holder case in 2013, is that it looks and it waits for states to commit infringements on people's rights. And from that point, it then allows the federal government to say, okay, if these types of incidences are happening in states, and so this that will basically then say, okay, then now the federal government has the oversight to purview these laws. So I think in some sense the John Lewis bill works better because it does put the federal government in that more of a reaction to something going wrong in terms of investigating. But when it does come into terms of pre-clearance, there is just at some level a distrust from the federal government towards the states to handle their laws and voter registration with integrity. I think this is highlighted in the massive amount of laws and state laws that immediately got changed after the Shelby v. Holder. In fact, Texas enacted new voting laws literally less than 24 hours after the Supreme Court decision. So I guess the reason that we want the federal oversight has had to happen is that earnestly that there just needs to be some type of extra oversight from the citizens because their states aren't behaving in the way they should. And this is actually kind of the philosophy behind the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, or the Bill of Rights, when it was originally written in our first, when the Constitution was first ratified, and we had the 10 items on the Bill of Rights. These prevented the federal government from doing these things to you. The state government could abridge any of those rights in any way they saw fit. State governments were not obliged to follow the Constitution. It was only what the federal government could not do to you. So in the 14th Amendment, one of the things, the way people will talk about it is they will say it nationalized the Bill of Rights. And so it basically meant that no state government agency can violate any clause of the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, not just the federal government. And so the 14th Amendment established the legal precedent for the federal government to be like, even forcing the Bill of Rights to be enforced on the states. In some sense, federalizing people's rights through the 14th Amendment because there were abuses of people's rights going on in the states, and the federal government took action through a constitutional amendment. So I think it's just one of those instances of where we like our state and local governments, but we also want to make sure there's a check on them as well. And in this instance, in the way our government's structured, that ends up being the federal government.
Ken, can you hear us now? You back?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
You were Batman
I got my
earlier. You're just kind of
laptop.
like hanging upside down.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
I was trying to figure out if it's just me or if it's just whatever. Got to figure it out.
The beautiful part is that the podcast listeners with no video will never have it. They'll be like, "Oh, Ken's pretty quiet."
The magic of editing.
Okay, so yes.
Batman.
So Ken, the question, we are down to the federalization of voting procedures. I think that power needs to remain at the state level. Josh is making the argument as to why it needs to be federalized. You can jump in now. You can go to Marcelo, but that's where we're at, is like, what is both the grounds and the benefits of making it federalized? Or if you want to talk about disadvantages, that's fair game too.
I mean, I guess for me, we talked about the 14th Amendment and everything like that, but there's also a part in the Constitution where it outlines that it's the states, within the states' right to write their own voting laws and everything like that. So I personally think if you're going to if you're trying to try to federalize an election, for example, you have to at least go through the constitutional process of amending the Constitution. And unfortunately, the way they're trying to go about it is just by a simple majority, which if you're trying to amend the Constitution by itself, that's a much harder process. And there's a reason why our founding fathers made the process harder. And the reason why I think the founding fathers made left the power to the states for the voting legislation is because the states, they know better what's best for their people, what's appropriate measure for them in particular, in order for them to go out and vote, and or election security in particular. So I definitely think and fall in line with within the state's rights to pass these legislations that they feel as though should be protected for people to basically rebuild the trust of what happened from the 2020 election, because that's basically what the response is with these election integrity laws. It's just a response to at least half the country that believes the election was at least the results were at least compromised. There's no evidence as far as there's enough election just election mishaps, for lack of a better term, that actually would have changed the outcome. But there's a lot. You cannot tell me for a moment there was no evidence of some dishonesty. So that's my take, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think when it comes to the election integrity, you're balancing a lot of things. I mean, you have millions and millions of people voting. There's going to be instances of voter fraud. Like, it's just not possible to have a perfect election. The statistical significance of that and its bearing on the election is, what would be the main focus there. Marcelo, you have thoughts on the federalization of the voting procedures, grounds and or benefits / disadvantages?
Right. I mean, maybe as a direct response to what Ken said about, the way they went about it, is that since obviously we're talking about bills that didn't pass and bills that, just died on the floor, is that obviously I would have liked this to pass, because I believe that federalization is oftentimes good, especially when it comes to elections, and especially when it comes to things like presidential elections. I don't see any, I see reasons. Obviously, I just don't necessarily agree with them. But in the case of procedure and how they try to pass this, I'll just say that the Constitution was made to be amended, in my opinion. And I feel like, going through the normal channels is pretty much impossible in the political landscape right now. I don't really have an answer to, should they have gone through the proper channels? Because I know that if they wanted to go through the proper channels, it would take them 200 years to pass anything. I don't remember the last time anything passed by a 2/3 vote. That sounds, and especially in such a controversial topic. And again, you're going to say that, I feel like people are going to say that this is as intended. But to me, it's such an important matter as voting rights and trying to preserve the integrity of our elections. I don't know if I'm gonna wait for 50 Republicans to agree with me, or at least 2/3 of that, then I think I'm just gonna be very old by the time that happens.
I definitely think it's interesting to see how the red states in particular, the voting laws are passed as a response to the 2020 election. And now the Democrats' proposed bills as a response to the election laws that are being passed in the red states right now. So I think that's pretty interesting to watch unfold.
Marcelo read my mind. It is as intended. So the way that I view it is, number one, the founding fathers were not fans of large, sweeping federalized government. They had just fled because of that, and they valued individual liberties, which is why they pushed those checks and balances. It's also why we are a representative, we're a republic rather than a true democracy, because the founding fathers knew that democracies crumbled after maybe a couple hundred years, but all the democracies up to that time had all crumbled. And so they wanted something that would be a little bit longer lasting. And so, people view it as a weakness now that I can't get, more than 50 people to pass something. And to me, that's exactly as it was intended, because we weren't designed to be bare majority, rule where a simple majority can run over the will of the people. That's, if you can't get that 2/3 filibuster proof majority, then it's not enough people that you get to just ram that through, which is now why the discussion has turned to how can we do away with the filibuster, because they want to run it over. And to me, it is most alarming that they're trying to justify this and say, well, voting rights is, it just justifies me doing what I want. You can always justify doing what you want. And it's problematic to me that they're trying to work around, like Ken had mentioned, the due process, just because they can maybe find a justification for it.
I just wish the due process wasn't so damn long, right? I wish some of these things, and obviously not about the same things, but you might agree with me on the process, is that, and especially as a progressive, I feel like I really want change enacted, not in like 3 like Senate terms, right? If we could get something done in like a legislative session, that would make me so happy. I understand. I'm gonna say I understand why it takes so long. I just wish it wouldn't take so long. Because again, if I have to wait for people to agree with me, then I'm gonna be sitting here a long time.
So this shifts the idea slightly, but the federalization and the reason that it's alarming to me is right now people might, especially the progressives, might support the enforcement of legislation they like. But if you federalize it, the Department of Justice largely answers to the president because the head of the Department of Justice is appointed by the president, which means that while you can say, oh, it's one of the systems and levers and it's not actually political, they're political. We've seen federal institutions operationalized on behalf of the president. And do we want that? Like, picture if Trump had been reelected, would you want Trump overseeing the future elections? If you are a Republican, do you want Biden overseeing the elections? To me, it's at the state level, there's more control. It's more answerable to the people, regardless of your party affiliation. Typically, you are grateful that nothing can be done when it's not something you want to be done. I think that kind of tends to go both ways.
I do think it walks this like interesting balance because, when the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act were passed, in 64 and 65 respectively, several states joined in coalition and, sued to the Supreme Court over both the bills, kind of even questioning this idea of federalization, of whether or not, this was allowable, that the federal government could have this oversight. Not necessarily that the government had too many requirements in the original like 65 bill of other than stop doing this, allow this. That one of the things that was heavily litigated over was, does the federal government have the authority to oversee what is going on? And I think that's reflected in a couple Supreme Court decisions that come by. So when we look at it is slipping off the top of my head, but it was part of the Voting Rights Act of 65 that outlawed outlawed poll taxes for federal elections. So what happened then is you had a bunch of state and local elections, particularly all 40, the rest of the states complied, and it was only 5 states that kept state and local poll taxes in there. Now, come 2 years after that, the Supreme Court comes and rules basically on the idea of the 14th Amendment, that the federal government had made this protection, that then if this protection wasn't being equally enforced across all member states of the United States, then the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, the promise of the federal government that everyone will be litigated and legislated equally, was not being upheld. And so they ruled in favor, for the most part, in the late 60s and early 70s. It started getting less favorable as you got to the mid 70s. But for the most part, those early court cases backed up that if the federal government would pass a piece of legislation, that the Supreme Court was willing to rule time and time again. And even when we consider the real defeat of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, it was not because the Supreme Court said the federal government does not have the purview. In fact, a large part of the John Lewis bill is almost word for word lifted from some of the justices' opinions about what was wrong. And what was wrong was the enactment clause. And that's because it targeted specific states instead of targeting people who were offending the law and breaking federal statutes. And that's what the new one does. So it does help provide some of those solutions of the constitutionality of voting rights in the past, but there has been time and time again of whether it was Andrew Jackson expanding the right to vote to all white men. That had to be litigated out because there was a lot of really wealthy business owners that sued his government for taking that action, saying the federal government has no say over this. So this federalization and control of the election has been time and time litigated throughout the Supreme Court, usually with the Supreme Court coming down on the side of the federal government saying, if this, needs to be done, as long as we're doing it in a way that fairly applies to all of the states, then, these are actions within the power and realms of the federal government.
So it's interesting that and Josh, that's a representation of a lot of the reason behind this bill being federalized. This is where I differ. I want to harken back to what Ken said, which was that this is unconstitutional. Josh is arguing that it can be constitutional because it's not discriminatory against specific states, it goes for all. Ken was arguing earlier and pointed out that it would be unconstitutional because the Constitution only delegates specific powers to the federal government. The idea, the 10th Amendment, that says that any powers not delegated to the federal government goes to the states, meant that we outlined in the Constitution specific powers that the federal government can do. Outside of that, anything the federal government does is unconstitutional. The argument that, and I would agree with Ken's assessment there. And Josh, I see the argument you're making that it can be considered more constitutional because it's not like you can't individually target people with a law because that would be unconstitutional. I still think that federalization, period, because it wasn't delegated to them to regulate these elections, is going to be unconstitutional on the grounds that it is not in the founding document, the Constitution, that the federal government has the power to do that. So federalizing like that there could be grounds for that being unconstitutional then.
I'm going to highly disagree with that because even while it wasn't in the original document with the 15th and 20th Amendment, we did add constitutional protections for the right to vote in the 15th on the basis of race and with the 20th on the basis of gender. So the right to vote and certain election protections have been enshrined into our Constitution. In fact, that's primarily one of the reasons that the Voting Rights Act was upheld in 65 and 66 when it was re-challenged again in the courts. Was the Supreme Court was able to look back and say, no, here are part of our constitutions that say the federal government is obliged to make sure no one is discriminated against on the basis of race, ethnicity, and sex. Because those had become part of our Constitution. We amended our Constitution and said this, the right to vote and not to be discriminated against for U.S. citizens is now an enshrined part of our Constitution. We made those amendments. It is now constitutional. I don't see how it could be unconstitutional to enforce other parts of the Constitution.
If it would be unconstitutional because if they're going to just say federal government gets to dictate, then that would have to be, like you mentioned, it would have to be a constitutional amendment. So what Ken was saying earlier, that this would have to go through a constitutional amendment process to be considered constitutional. If they don't do that, as in they were trying to get it by with just the majority of votes. In fact, now they're even talking about just killing the filibuster so they can get it by with a bare majority, 50+1. That's not constitutional enshrinement then, because they're not passing it as a constitutional amendment.
I think there's a thought, though, of how our government works. That is, Congress writes the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. Because oftentimes you'll get, Congress will come through and write a law, and it will be X, Y, and Z, and then the court, will give nitty-gritty rulings of like, this is how this needs to play out. So when they put in the put into the Constitution, no one can be discriminated, to the right to vote on the basis of their, race or ethnicity. That then says that the federal government has to pass laws to make sure that happens. To fulfill the obligations of the 15th and 20th Amendment, they have to pass these federalization laws, or they're not actually doing what that the constitutionality says. So when the Voting Rights Act gets challenged, then the federal government is interpreting it against the primarily the 14th, 15th amendments, and saying, does this, do these laws uphold the integrity of the amendments presented here and the actions of the federal government? And time again, up until the regional, targeting from Section 4, the Supreme Court has always ruled in favor. And it's been a bipartisan signing with it coming in 1965. Richard Nixon signed an extension. Gerald Ford signed an extension. Ronald Reagan signed the first of the 25-year extensions. And then in 2006, another 25-year extension of the Voting Rights Act was passed. So this has long kind of been a bipartisan agreement of, since we have these constitutional amendments, Congress has the obligation to litigate around and make sure people's rights are protected, and not in a passive way. The federal, and earnestly, we don't want our government sitting around to an extent waiting for us to be infringed upon to take action. It would be better if they would prevent us from being infringed upon in the first place.
So to keep on time, we are going to swivel then to voter IDs, and we'll kick it to Marcelo and Ken.
I think Ken had a response because
Done
I
that.
saw him like unmuting.
Oh, yeah. Then go ahead, Ken.
I was just gonna say because I agree with you, Josh, as far as it is the federal government's responsibility to make sure the states are applying federal law and following the Constitution by itself. But to kind of make the point I was making earlier, as far as this voting bill is a response to these red states passing election integrity laws, what do you feel as though are these states? What rights are these states violating from your perception? That's really what I wanted to say, because I agree with you, but I want to hear your perspective as far as like what do you think is being violated right now in these states that are passing voter election laws?
So one of voter ID laws, and like, so we'll shelve that to after we get done with that because it's a whole thing. But a couple of the other things. One of the primary things is the closing of polling locations, and this has impact on a lot of different factors. If the lines are longer, that makes it harder for the elderly and infirm to vote. Not everyone has the physical constitution to stand in line to vote for 5, 6, 7 hours. And we should not want our democracy to take 5, 6, 7 hours to vote on. And since the removal of the Section 4B from the Voter Rights Act, there have been more than 1,000 polling places closed in primarily Black communities. And this also, target a lot of Latino communities as well. And we even see like sometimes a county will be reduced down to a single polling location, and people can sometimes have to drive 30, 40 minutes to their polling location to then wait hours in line to then find out that they've been purged off the voter rolls, because that was one of the other protections that the Voting Rights Act saw, was that to make sure that voter roll purges have been done. Now, voter roll purges are important. Sometimes, depending on how the state works, when you die, the Social Security Administration will contact the state, and so they can take you off the list because they know you're dead. Some states will let that build up and have like a yearly clear out process. However, there is a lot of different ways they have found to purge people off, and even the nonpartisan commission from the federal government, along with the Brennan Center for Justice, which specializes in election laws, saw from 2014 to 2016, there were 16 million people removed from the voter rolls. Most of those people had died, but that was a 33% increase over 2006 to 2008. And the Brennan Center of Justice estimated there was about 2 million legitimate voters who were removed from the voter rolls for the 2016 election that weren't in the 2014 election. So you can imagine like this is a combo effect, and this is a point that the American Civil Liberties Union points out, that if you've been voting in every past election and then you show up to your voting place and you wait 5, 6, 7 hours in line for the polls, and then you get up to there and you find out that you've been purged off the rolls and no one notified you, no one told you of this, no one sent you a letter saying, hey, you need to re-register, this just happened and no one contacted you, how likely are you to come back for the next election? It can, in my opinion, it undermines that dramatically undermines. So I think it's a matter of accessibility, especially in terms of polling places. And like a lot of like early voting, very specifically targeted some nasty things, like in the Georgia election bill that came up to try to close Sunday voting. Well, that's enshrined in a tradition in the Black community, especially in Georgia, called Souls to the Polls, where during early voting periods, they would meet and gather, have a normal church service, and then the churches would go to the polls and vote as a community action. That's why they called it Souls to the Polls. Georgia tried to pass a law that would eliminate early voting on Sundays during early voting periods. And so why target something that is explicitly taking people to the polls and to vote? And such a law like that wouldn't have been possible with Section 4B in place or the John Lewis Act, because it would have been subject to the DOJ review. So my concern is there's a lot of legitimate voters, to order of magnitude more legitimate voters, who get taken off and make it harder to vote, to try to prevent what is normatively a few hundred to a few thousand miscast or wrongly cast ballots, which most of the time are just paperwork, clerical errors, with usually sometimes in the low hundreds of actual voter fraud occurring per year from all evidence of state and local government, the Department of Justice, and the FBI can find. that there just isn't enough widespread fraud to justify removing hundreds of thousands of Americans from the polls, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Ken.
So I was just gonna say, I think context is everything, right? So like the 1,000 polls that have been closed in predominantly Black neighborhoods and everything like that. Do you know like the actual justification of why those polls were closed? I think it's important for us when we see something like that to not automatically assume it's a racial thing, because if we do that, then we kind of we watered down the term racism essentially. And
Yeah,
it's one.
well, between
So
2013 and 2016, there was about 1,350 polling locations closed, and 1,000 of those were in Black neighborhoods. 200 of them were in Latino neighborhoods, and less than, I think, 50 were in white neighborhoods. So
right.
even if they were making budget cuts, they selected where those budget cuts would be made, and what seems to be a fairly clear pattern.
I guess the question again, go back to like, did you actually look into their reasoning why they had those budget cuts and why they closed those polls, instead of just assuming it was a racial thing and there was racial bias? Excuse me.
I mean, if you have to close polling locations, maybe close one in every, kind of district. And because if you have to consolidate poll workers, or you have lost, funding, and you don't have as many election workers, this question still remains of, if they had to be closed, why those communities, and why not more of an equal distributed closing that tried to keep in mind drive times and access and wait times that polls had seen before, to try to flow better. There's even the kind of like a better options. Like when I was in getting my degree at Middle Tennessee State University, one of the things the county did was they changed it so that you could actually vote at any polling location if you were registered in the county. They made a digital database of the voter registration, so you weren't bound to a specific location. So you could actually go to the one that was just closest to you, regardless of how the actual little lines were drawn up by the county map. And so that improved, that was like really helpful for a lot of people. And so things like that can come into play. And so the question is just like, sure, we can say an action had to be made, or maybe polls had to be closed, but why those polls, and why in such misshapen, percentages and demographics and areas targeted?
So to Ken's point, one of the other data points you would have to look at is, and maybe you know the answer to this, maybe you don't, but you would have to know what is the population surrounding those polls, because if they happen to close polls that were lower populations and then allow those people to go to larger populations, that is one thing that would make it to where you might want to hold off on the racial bias judgment at that point. And I mean, it just depends on whether or not you know that.
And I do want to quickly point out with the Georgia law that since they did actually close the polling on Sunday and everything like that, they did actually extend early day voting as well, to put in context. So they may have closed the pollings for Sunday in particular, but they also extended the amount of days you can vote early as well. So that actually gives them more time to put in the casting a vote, and just kind of having that perception and context also helps to kind of really destroy this narrative that these not just voter ID laws, but just election integrity laws are just racially charged and biased towards Latino and the Black community in general. I think you have to be very careful with what you say surrounding that, because words matter. And if you start claiming everything to be racist, then the term racist loses its value, it loses its weight. And so I don't think personally there's anything wrong for asking someone to show an ID, for example. And a person of color myself, I personally have no issue with having to show an ID somewhere. I mean, we have to show ID when we go to the airport. We have to show an ID when we go buy alcohol, cigarettes even, or if you're trying to get CBD products, for crying out loud. So it's kind of interesting to see, to me anyway, how none of those are considered racist, but for some reason, something like showing ID to vote, that's racially charged. But that's what I'm trying to connect the dots from what I hear sometimes.
I don't think we're calling everything racist. I think we're calling it racist. That's such a high amount of polling places in Black and Latino neighborhoods are being closed. Well, obviously, they're not gonna, like, in the reason justification, like in the paper where they close the polling location, they're not gonna be like, yes, we're racist, we close this place because we're racist. That's never gonna happen. They're always gonna find another reason. I think the statistical likelihood of these places being closed, specifically in these neighborhoods, and yeah, they might put, a lower population, too many people vote in mail, so that's why we're closing. There's not enough people use it. At the same time, Black and Latino neighborhoods are more likely to live in urban areas. So again, obviously, you're never gonna go into the archives and like dig deep into whoever filed this closure and then find the gem that says, yes, we're racist, we close this place because we're racist. It's just a matter of analyzing.
I guess my only question or response to that would be, just, I don't know, to me, it kind of seems a little insulting to insinuate people of color are incapable of meeting these requirements to vote. If they want to go out and vote, if you care enough to vote, you'll find a way to vote. And to suggest that somehow this puts us at a disadvantage, to me, by itself, intentional or not, is kind of racist too. But that's just me, though.
Yeah, I don't think you should care that much to vote. I think I don't think putting like a threshold, like, you should be willing to travel 20 minutes in the snow to be able to vote. I think everyone should be able to vote within a reasonable amount of like space. Again, I don't know if it's like a matter of effort, and if you didn't put enough effort, then you didn't, deserve to vote. I think it's, if I could vote with my phone, I would do it. Again, not me, I cannot vote, but I think it should be easy enough so that people shouldn't feel burdened or feel like they have to prove something to go and vote.
All right, well, we're going to have to come back with our hot takes, final thoughts. So we will be right back with those. You're listening to the Central Hub for Political Discourse, self-proclaimed by us. And Ken, we don't actually go anywhere. So I'll kick it over to Josh. Probably try to keep it under 2 minutes so we stay within time.
So one of the more complicated aspects of when we're litigating out voter rights, and I think Ken pointed out, of like the struggle of identifying of how do we know when something is a discriminatory intentional action and when it's not. And in legal doctrine, this is what we call what is called the separation of Bull Connor racism versus kind of this passer racism. Bull Connor is named after some Alabama politician who's not worth remembering any more than that. So this basically means if you don't explicitly say, hey, go do something racist, it's going to be really hard to prove in court. This was like litigated out, especially in a case that happened in California, where a county that had a population of about under 10% Black population, somehow or another, the police ended up pulling for 60% of all traffic stops from that 9% or so Black population in the town. They came to the Supreme Court and said, hey, this is a clear pattern of discrimination and racial profiling on the basis of the police. Well, the Supreme Court said, the police chief never said, hey, go out and target these people explicitly. So we're not sure, and we're not willing to say that this pattern indicates an explicit piece of racism. In 2016, the North Carolina tried to change their election laws, and they actually messed up and committed an act of Bull Connor racism. And so the Supreme Court quickly struck it down. And that was when they were evaluating new voter ID laws. They specifically requested from their State Department the racial demographics of who held what IDs. And in the drafts of the legislation that they were working through the House, they specifically eliminated the IDs that qualified as being useful and being valid forms of identification towards the Black community. So the more of the Black community that owned a particular type of an ID, the more likely it was to be not included as a valid form of voter ID law. And so they made this, they made that act of Bull Connor racism, and so the law got struck down quickly after it was passed. And so I do think that's kind of the difference, and that's something we have to be careful for, is that because of the legal game surrounding voting rights and civil rights, there has been this way of trying to do and get racist results without saying racist things, because that's when the Supreme Court can actually get you. But if you can hide it away and make it seem unintentional, you have better protection from the court system. And I think that's just something as a society we need to, deal with. And that's why these statistical observations and looking to see what the impacts of policy legislations, even if they're intended good, the pathway to hell is paved with good intention, good intentions. So we want to make sure of the effects and impacts of policies are good and not just what we want them to do in the first place.
So my first hot take is going to be that in order to have massive sweeping federalized reform, you need to demonstrate that there's a need for that. I don't think that there's been that demonstration. I think that when people talk about the need to pass these types of voter reforms, they rely very, very heavily on historic racism, Bull Connor racism, which were terrible things, but they can't pinpoint things that happen today other than potential dog whistling or like the more covert forms of racism. And I think that along with that, it's important to remember that it's equally convenient to be able to say that it's dog whistling at racism because the people who are claiming that don't have the same burden of proof. You can point out that there's a discrepancy in where polls were shut down, but we don't actually dissect the data. They look at the aggregate result, the overall result, and they say, boom, clearly that's an instance of racism, federal intervention. My main point on this first hot take here is that you can't just give over the control to the federalization portion of the government. Like Josh said, road to hell is paved with good intentions. You might have the good intentions to protect specific rights here, but you're also undercutting other ones. And I think that demonstrating the need for that intervention is very important. My last hot take is that there's a lot of conflation between the right to vote with easy voting. It was mentioned a little bit today, but the fact that people have to stand in line, the fact that people might have to travel a little bit further to vote is it's not evidence of racism. It's not evidence of voter suppression. It just means that that's the way that it is. And I think that we need to be very careful, again, as we're trying to demonstrate evidence to then turn over to the federal government, the federalization of running elections, which then requires the states to be at the mercy of a federally controlled entity. I think you need a little bit more concrete evidence than that. I'll turn it over to Marcelo.
I have two real quick hot takes. The first one is the one I already mentioned last episode, and is that I just wish that they would pass these things, or I guess attempt to pass these things one by one, so that people could, again, get them to the floor, get them to a vote, and have these people say no to each of these things individually, so that I would have to stop hearing the argument of like, well, it's, the bill's too big, so that's why it failed. I had one thing that I didn't like, so sorry, I couldn't support your other 49 things. I think that would solve a lot of things. The second one is, again, I already said this, but having to keep waiting for this change to pass simply because, like 50 people, I guess 52 people in the Senate don't really agree with my position is infuriating, is really frustrating. And we're in this, ping pong table. Like in this case, like just like we were in the last, in 2016 to 2020, where it was the Democrats' job to sort of like obstruct and take Trump to court and everything that he did. Now it's like Republicans are super proud of being like obstructionists and trying to like block everything that the Democratic Party is trying to do. I hate it, obviously. And I also think that it's very much telling of the political landscape that we live in today. It's just it's going to be very annoying, and the midterms are coming up. So it's only going to become more annoying, where it's like, your measure of how worth your worth to the party is of how much you're going to disagree with the other side. Regardless of whether or not you stand on these issues or not. I don't like cinema, and I don't like Joe Manchin. And with that, I'll end.
I guess it's my turn. All right, so I guess my hot take would be, first and foremost, I am pretty thankful that the passage of this new federal voting law failed. First and foremost, I think if it would have passed, would have put us a step closer to a third world country status, personally. I know you didn't really hear my opinion or initial take on the federal law earlier because of my computer issues, but so there's that. But I also want to say it is very important for us to kind of stop using race as a shield for anything bad or anything that we disagree with, because if we start using race for everything that we disagree with, kind of what I was saying earlier, it just really waters down the severity of that term racism in general. So we have to be, when it comes to like these election integrity laws and everything like that, which I think is completely justified too, especially from what happened in the 2020 election. I don't really agree with the media's assessment. There's no evidence of widespread voter fraud necessarily. And I think as a matter of fact, there's been forensic election audits that have come out, for example, in Texas, after they passed their voter laws and everything like that. They had to take out over 200,000 registered dead people off their voter rolls. And that's quite a significant number. Or a state like Wisconsin, where the election audit came out to be where it wasn't a 93% turnout, but instead of 74% turnout. So these election integrity laws that are passing in these, strong Republican strongholds anyway, is completely justified. And I think it's a little irresponsible to assume that it's because of race that these laws are being passed. But it's also a reflection that we're just living in two different realities as far as what's going on in America. And I think we should just give each other a little bit of slack and just kind of remember that at the end of the day, we're still human beings, and we're just trying to search for truth. And all of us, especially the people on this show, we actually do care about what's going on in this country. And we just have a different idea of how to resolve some of these issues. So that's my hot take.
All right. I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. Glad we finally figured out your your whole computer issues. We will be back here Saturday at noon Central. We'll get around to being live eventually, but we'll have you back again sometime, Ken. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye for now.
All right, have a good one.